I have the pleasure to introduce you to this audience, Brian.
Okay.
You know me, so I don't have to introduce myself. And I'll do it in a kind of, I know Brian since 2005. In 2005, we were setting up Institute Paralimes in the Netherlands. And I was in the middle of some complicated negotiations, and then the telephone rang. And the other guy said, I'm Brian Arthur. And I was totally shocked because he was the guy that we wanted to have all the time. And I never talked to him. And he was just on the phone. And Brian said, I heard you're setting up the Institute Paralimes in the Netherlands. I want to be part of it. So a few days later, he flew into, from Vienna, I think it was, to the Netherlands, and we had a very nice meeting. And Brian then gave the talk during dinner, totally impromptu, because I asked him 10 minutes before if he would be willing to give a talk, and he really thrilled the audience. There was something like 30 people that really were instrumental in setting up the Institute Paralimes. He thrilled the audience with a 45 minutes talk about how wonderful Santa Fe was and how worthwhile it was to try to set up something like this in Europe. Later, Brian helped me set up the principles of how to develop such an institute. And the fact that we still exist is largely thanks to, I would say, the fact that you were there from the very beginning, Brian, and therefore we're very pleased that you are now willing to get up very early to give us a talk about whatever you was going to talk about. Please welcome Brian.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'm in California and it's dawn here. It's still getting light. So if I'm not very well lit, that's the reason. And I'm delighted to take part in the conference. I should tell you that in 2018, I spent some time at the Bay Air Institute. So I know it fairly well. And I know Victor Galas, obviously, and others there, and I send them my greetings. I want to start in 1980. I've changed the title of my talk a little bit, and I want to talk about the economy under conditions of uncertainty. But as part of this conference on the illusion of control. In 1980, I was working in Vienna at IIASA, and I was sent on business to what was then the Soviet Union, to CEMI, Central Economic Mathematical Institute there. And they told me this story. So the May Day parade is happening, and all the top communist bigwigs are gathered on top of the Lenin Mausoleum, watching the troops march past. And some not very powerful troops start off the parade, and they're followed by troops in armored vehicles, and then they're followed by soldiers in tanks, and they're followed by even more powerful artillery. And so this parade goes on for hours and hours, and finally it ends up with intercontinental ballistic missiles, super destructive weapons. And that seems to be the end of the parade. And Brezhnev is up watching all this. He's secretary of the Communist Party at the time. And they're all watching this, and then finally, after all the destructive missiles go past, there's a straggling corps of soldiers, but they're not really in uniform, and they're dressed in gray suits, and the suits don't fit very well, and they're all out of step. So Brezhnev is quite irritated, and he turns to his aide and he says, "Tell me," he says, what is this corps of soldiers? So the aide looks it all up in his briefing document and says, Party Secretary Brezhnev, this is the corps of economists. And Brezhnev says, but why are they in Mayday Parade? He looks it up, says, Party Secretary Brezhnev. Anyway, the punchline was, with all these economists, you would not believe the damage these men can do. And I thought this was very funny at the time. It was 1980. I was quite cynical about economics and what it could control, what it could do. I find that as I get older now, maybe this is natural, I'm a lot less cynical. I think economics, as a profession or as theorists or as policy advisors, economics can control quite a lot. It can understand pretty well international trade. It can understand how currencies work. It understands, I think, very well indeed, macroeconomics and macroeconomic adjustments. It understands the economics of antitrust or monopolies. It understands banking. And so none of these things were that well understood 100 or 150 years ago, but they're much better and pretty well understood now. What economics doesn't understand very well is how to prevent financial collapses. Those still occur at an alarming rate. It doesn't understand economic development very well and can't really control that. You can't snap your fingers and say, wherever in Burundi, now we're going to develop. It doesn't understand the demographic transition. So you go into Nigeria and you say, birth rates are going to fall within the next 5 years as a matter of control or policy. There are things economics doesn't understand very well. As we've seen recently, it doesn't understand pandemics too well, and it has a mixed bag on disasters. It can't prevent earthquakes and hurricanes. Maybe economics can help in the cleanup after those. So economics can't really control unexpected upheavals. And what I want to talk about this morning or this afternoon is these upheavals. We've had quite a few of them in the last several years. I'm talking here from a US perspective, not worldwide, but I think a lot of what I have to say applies to the EU and very possibly to Sweden in particular. So we've had COVID, we've had, as a result of that, disrupted supply chains from China and elsewhere. That's led to inflation, inflationary pressures, banking crises. We've had a war in Ukraine, which is, I think, pretty well independent of COVID, but very unexpected. We have a sudden deterioration of relations with China. We have, and I'm speaking here in Silicon Valley, we've had the rise of generative AI, which promises to change a lot of white-collar work, possibly. In the US and elsewhere, we've had threats to democracy, all against a background of ongoing climate change. Except for climate, all of these upheavals surprised us. They were largely unforeseen in advance, but they kind of rocked the boat enormously. I would say this, we're back at work now. This is true in the US, true in Europe, true in China even. We're back at work, but at least here in America, the mood in the economy has changed. And I was trying to think, in what way has the mood changed? Well, there's a definite feeling here that, yeah, we're back at work, but the basic arrangements of the economy, trade agreements, financial arrangements, democratic provisions, here in the US, the reasonableness of high court decisions, the very dependability of public health, none of these can be quite relied upon anymore. We don't quite know, and this is a really prevailing mood. I asked a lot of people what they thought the mood was. We no longer know what arrangements we can fully trust without something going wrong with them. And to some degree, we've lost the feeling of standing on solid ground. We don't know what's coming next. There's a nice piece of economic jargon, fundamental uncertainty, and it basically means you don't know what's coming next. So I would say we've entered a world of fundamental uncertainty. Keynes described this in 1937 this way. He said, the prospect of a European war, the rate of interest 20 years hence, price of copper in 3 years' time, about these matters, there's no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability, whatever. We simply do not know. So what I'm arguing is that in several parts of the world, we've entered a world of not knowing. And this would seem, we know plenty, of course, but some of the bigger shifts, upheavals, the seismic events, if you like, we simply don't know. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know what to expect. And this would seem to be an inconvenient trait, maybe an innocuous one, but I would argue it carries heavy implications, at least for economists. When you don't know what's coming next, you can't make logical calculations about that. And that means that rational decision-making or rational policy-making is undefined. You don't know what's going to happen, so you can't plan for that. That means the whole canon of decision theory, by the way, this delights me, taught in business schools, no longer applies. So if indeed we've entered a period of heightened uncertainty in the economy, I would argue both in the US and to quite some degree in the EU, and we don't know what is coming next, what's afoot, what happens, what would economics have to say about a system like this? How would it play out? Is there any way of controlling things? Let me put a couple of slides up at this stage, if I can manage, just a sec. Yeah, so we're shifting to uncertainty. So how do economies behave under fundamental uncertainty? If it's true we've entered this period where everything's shaky, not much at the fundamental level, at the grounded level, can be relied upon. How do economies behave under fundamental uncertainty? First thing I would say is that the system automatically adjusts, not totally, but to some degree, in fact, to quite some degree. I want to sort of demonstrate that. I want to imagine a certain world, the sort that we've been used to 10 years ago or more, and now an uncertain world. So in a certain or well-grounded world, you can rely, this is my definition, on institutional structures and social arrangements. You can rely on alliances, partners, architectures. You can rely, if you're in Sweden, you could rely on Russia. You can rely on trading agreements. In such a world, it follows that you can put together alliances that work, you can build on what works, and you can reach out and create quite elaborate structures that are interconnected and complicated. And some of the parts of these elaborate structures may be controlled by foreign partners. And everything still works. This is by assumption because you're in a certain world. And that's the sort of world I think we certainly did have, if not right now, that's the sort of world we were in, I would say 10 years ago, just quite some degree. In that world, you can dedicate your organization to growth and efficiency and reasonably expect things to work out very well. In uncertain world, this is a sort of ungrounded world that I'm arguing we're in at the moment, or we're heading into, you're subject to surprises and upheavals. You can't count on the grounding arrangements of foreign partners and outside alliances. You could still pursue growth and efficiency, but now these count for less. Managing here, getting through here, policy making here is more about observing how the world is unfolding, making sense of what's happening, exploring and adapting to uncertainty. And if at the very extreme, the object is to survive, to stay in the game, you need structures that are lighter and more adaptable. And in this sort of highly uncertain world, elaborate structures are not appropriate. There are too many moving parts, too many things have to go right, too many outside agents need to perform as promised. So you start to create simple structures and to bring things into your own sphere of control. You can set up alliances, but now you're doing those for mutual stability. In this sort of uncertain world, stability is what counts more than anything else. So I have some observations on this. Globalization has driven a lot of the EU economy and the American one for many years, and on the other side, it's driven the Chinese economy. But now globalization, or offshoring, loosely speaking, looks different. So if the world is reliable in certain world, offshoring can allow whatever you're consuming to be made much more cheaply in a different country. Both the home economy, say the US, and the offshore countries, say China, benefit. And this was the case after Fukushima, when Germany started to outsource much of its energy production to Russia. This worked at least for some time. In an uncertain world, by contrast, offshoring may start to be inconvenient or inappropriate. Elaborate structures don't work. Political structures, think US and China, or maybe EU and China, may no longer quite align. Offshore arrangements may be dangerous. There may be a fall off in mutual trust. Unforeseen upheavals, think of COVID, may disrupt supply chains. So all of these impair offshore arrangements, and if they're severe enough, it starts to make sense to bring production home and under domestic control. Thus, you can see in the US is steadily bringing back production from China. I don't think it will bring back anything like all of production, but it's bringing back the production of sensitive goods. There was an act passed in 2022, the CHIPS Act is a federal law to bring back semiconductor production from China to the US. By the way, there's been a lot of pushback from free market economists say, well, the government shouldn't be intervening. If something can be made more cheaply abroad, let it be made abroad. But the government is intervening in the US. Germany and much of the EU similarly have pulled back a lot of their energy supply from Russia. So countries are seeking stability. I would say this makes sense over the theories that say otherwise assume that the world is reliable. Similarly, there are new alliances. Finland, as you're well aware, has joined the NATO alliance. Sweden is seeking to, as you know. So overall, there is a shift towards greater stability. I want to say a word or two about efficiency and pursuing that via optimization. There's a tendency in business, certainly, to take part of the the operations you're dealing with. I'm thinking of supply chains and other things, and trying to optimize these. That may work pretty well in a certain world, but it doesn't work very well in an uncertain or unreliable world. In fact, as a general rule, I think optimization brings brittleness. That's because when a system is optimized, all its parts must work seamlessly. Some of its parts, I'm thinking of things like jet engines, may be pushed to work at their limit. If you try to push a jet engine to work harder, it might melt down the combustion chambers, so that any expected large loading can break a component down and cause breakdown. I think that this is very much, if you start to go after optimizing operations under very narrow criterion of optimizing profit, you're taking a very large risk. Recently, as a recent case within the last 4 or 5 years, famous case of the Boeing 737 MAX. It started with a design difficulty on the way the larger power plant or jet engines need to be hung. This caused a tendency, if I recall, for the aircraft to pitch up a little bit in flight. So a special software unit was installed. It wasn't much talked about, but it was installed, and it relied on 2 airspeed sensors working properly each side of the plane. Some people discovered when they were trying to sell planes abroad that they could optimize sales by selling planes just with 1 sensor and without training the pilots on the new software. These things were optional. So they were trimming costs. What happened was 2 fatal crashes resulted, as you recall, and I would say Boeing is still yet to recover from that disaster. It's easy to trim costs, and you might be able to do it in a very reliable world, but it's not always wise. So I think that in the coming time, there'll be much less emphasis on optimization, more on stability. One of the things I've been talking so far about adaptation at higher levels, that when economies become fundamentally uncertain and you can't control them, you can't assign probabilities, you don't know what's going to come next, a certain retrieval of stability sets in, and the economy automatically adjusts, at least at higher levels, or adapts, seeking more stability. It doesn't do this on its own, of course. I think there are policymakers behind this and people at high levels making decisions that they need more reliability, more stability. What I want to argue is this happens at all levels. Adaptation, I want to talk about adaptation here. Adaptation is possible at all levels, not just at the policy level, not just at international levels, not just at the lowest levels. It happens at the level of commerce and business throughout. And the more disruptions you get, the more adaptation is sought. But I want to point out a very important quality about adaptation. It does not happen on its own. There's no such thing as an economy being adaptive or a company being adaptive. Adaptation basically relies on having at the ready a repertoire of available responses. So you're saying, okay, I can adapt, but what do I have to adapt with? In places where there's constant electricity shutdowns, I'm thinking of countries like South Africa, hospitals have backup generators so they can quickly adapt within a few minutes. In the face of being harmed by infectious diseases, humans have an immune system. So adaptation, which will be much more needed in this economy we're heading into, lies, I would say, in having such backup preparedness. It lies in having a toolkit of people or plans or responses, or maybe even ideas or attitudes or possibilities that will get us through the difficulties. These don't always have to be elaborate, and getting through the difficulties may take time. I was looking at the movie a week ago, Apollo 13, if you recall. The actual Apollo mission happened a long time ago, 1970. The aircraft or the space capsule got into trouble not very far from moon orbit, and part of the apparatus sort of blew off in a minor explosion. So the Apollo 13 mission had to be brought home. And that happened in various stages. At each stage, there were adaptations. There was a stage, obviously, of re-entry, but there were stages before that where CO2 within the capsule was rising to a dangerous level where the occupants couldn't breathe enough oxygen and might pass out. That part of the solution turned out to be executed, to my great amusement, by judicious use of cardboard and duct tape. Mission Control in Houston figured out how you would put together or modify the carbon dioxide emissions and cut those off and raise oxygen levels. So it's a nice illustration that solutions are not constructed from anything magical. They're always constructed from what lies at hand. And therefore it pays to have things lying at hand, maybe not in an obsessive way, but certainly in a way that where you've got redundancy, metaphorically, you have your backup generators ready to roll at a moment's notice. I was reminded when I started to think about this of a lesson from biology. There's something called Fisher's theorem. If you're a biologist, you might know what that means. But it tells us that the pace at which a species can adapt is proportional to the diversity within its population. Sounds a bit abstract, but suppose due to some sudden environmental change in the Galapagos Islands, finches there suddenly, I don't know what might have happened, drier climate or wetter climate or something, but let's say finches in the Galapagos Islands suddenly require longer beaks. Descendant populations can only achieve longer beaks. This is pretty trivial if there are longer beak individuals already present to breed from. So that's really Fisher's theorem or Fisher's law. If there are a lot of long beak individuals around, you can adapt pretty quickly to longer beaks. Adaptation, in other words, requires material to work with. The counterpart, as I said earlier, in commerce is to have a diversity of ideas, people, and designs to draw from when needed. One of the things I want to point out is that adaptation, which I believe will be prevalent and much more prevalent in this economy of surprises and uncertainty, everything adjusting to everything. It takes significant time and it takes experimentation. And even when it's finished, it's not perfect. And I think there's a really illuminative example in the COVID pandemic. I certainly remember, what happened, I think, in just about all countries, all economies, was that we didn't know what had hit us at first. I remember on the 12th of March, 2020, I was a member of the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford, and we all had our offices. It was a Monday, if I recall. We went in. The director of the center said, "We're waiting in a few days. Stanford University will tell us what their long-term plan is for COVID, and they'll announce that possibly this week or next week." What actually happened was by 4 p.m, Stanford was shut down. We were shut down. We were told to leave our offices, and our year at the Center for Advanced Studies was over. And I think that we all have been through that. What I want to point out is that the mood then was, I wouldn't say it was totally fearful, but we did not know what was going to hit us next. We didn't know how severe these original variants were, at that time the Delta variant. We didn't know how transmissible it was. We didn't know how severe the illness would be, or what the mortality rates would be. We didn't know any of that because the whole thing had just hit us. We didn't know how long it would take to develop vaccines. The best guess, at least in March 2020, was that would be a couple of years away. And even that was stretching it. We were told very shortly there were experiments with social distancing. We were told there'd be lockdowns. I'm sure you're familiar with this wherever you were in March 2020. There were experiments working at home. What I want to point out is that this is the typical thing when these unexpected upheavals, that's what I'm labeling these, suddenly appear. You could say similar things with the outbreak of war in the Ukraine. Of course, we weren't directly affected, but we were hammered, thinking, oh my God, is this the end of peaceful relations in the middle of Europe? And we didn't know what to think. We did. So there's a period from not knowing anything to experimenting with solutions, in this case, lockdowns and working at home. Vaccines, to our great surprise, appeared much earlier than expected. Turned out that many labs had been experimenting with messenger RNA vaccines. So those were like the backup generators. They weren't quite ready, but amazingly, COVID hit the economy, or hit us personally, in March 2020. And 2 months later, messenger RNA vaccines had gone into early clinical trials. And later that year, with emergency approval, they were approved for general use later on in the year 2020. And I believe, and I want to emphasize this, this was possible because much of the mRNA technology had been developed and was standing by. It wasn't ready for COVID or SARS-2. It was, that had to be sequenced, and it was sequenced by China, and then the sequence was sent to various countries. What interests me is that the same upheaval pretty well hit every country. This includes Sweden, certainly includes countries in Europe, In particular, it includes China, and it includes New Zealand and other countries. China and New Zealand took on quite stringent policies. Sweden was, as far as I know, to quite some degree at the other end of the scale. America was somewhere in the middle, and due to a lot of politics, there was a lot of messing around in America. Well, only Democrats socially distance, only they will wear face masks and so on. Real people don't have to protect themselves, etc., etc. What we saw was many, many experiments in adaptation to one given upheaval. And I think there's an awful lot to learn from sifting through in retrospect and looking at what worked and what didn't work. Certainly the US does not score high on results. And if I recall right, 1 million or more people died in this country in the US, and there's still 1,000 people per week dying of COVID here. I want to say a word because I think there's a mindset that goes with responding to uncertainty. It's not just the physical ability to adapt. It's not just having labs in the background that are working on RNA vaccines. Of course, it's also a mental attitude or mental mindset. If you are moving into an economy or a situation where you can't trust the ground you're standing on, you can't trust agreements, you can't trust government arrangements, the mindset is, to one degree or another, one of seeking stability, or at another extreme, it's a mindset of survival. It's a mindset of letting go of constricted beliefs. Maybe masks work, maybe masks don't work, but you have to experiment and see. It's certainly a mindset of taking one step at a time. We try this, doesn't work very well. We try that. It's a mindset, and this is using a Chinese expression, of crossing the river by feeling the stones. You're crossing a shallow river, you can't see what's on the bottom, and you might sink into the mud, so you're feeling for the stones underneath. I believe Chairman Deng said this when China started to experiment with capitalist markets. Well, we don't know how this is going to work out, but we'll cross the river by feeling the stones. I want to say something else here, that the prevalent feeling, at least at the start of some of these upheavals, is confusion. And confusion, I would argue, is not always bad. Uncertainty, think of that week in March or in early March 2020, brings confusion. What are we going to do now? Are we going to work at home? Will we be shut down? Will we be locked down? When will there be vaccines? You're not quite sure what situation you are in or what you should do. And my main comment on this is that very often confusion's really uncomfortable. It's completely unpleasant. But I want to argue it's not always a bad thing. I come from Northern Ireland originally, and I remember that in the middle of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a BBC television reporter is in the middle of a lot of throwing of Molotov cocktails, and the BBC television reporter stopped a man in the street and asked him what he thought was going on politically. He said, "What do you think is going on here?" And the random guy in the street says, "I don't know." So the reporter says, "It seems that you're confused politically." And the man replied, "Mister," he says, "if you're not confused, you don't know anything." So this is very much not a bad thing, because confusion, which comes with all these sudden surprises, if you go along with it, confusion can remake us. You go from not knowing, but you're forced to find, or forced to construct, or forced to put together a new version of your project or your policy or your organization. Or if you're confused personally, you're forced to put together a new version of yourself, one that's appropriate to this new world. This takes time, it's pretty slow, and it certainly takes a lot of courage. I believe the ability to live with confusion, and I'm a researcher, and many people listening are researchers too. We live with confusion. We don't know how something works, but we don't mind investigating that. So the ability to live with confusion is valuable. So I want to summarize at this stage. What I'm arguing is that certainly in the US, and I would include Canada and North America, and the EU, and I would throw in China, most of developed economies, the EU, the UK as well, we're entering a period where the old grounded arrangements are much less reliable, and we seem to be getting hit by one thing after another. We're not even sure in the US at the moment whether our federal credit arrangements will last for the next 3 weeks. So it's a period of political instability, a period of other instabilities. Relations with China could well get much worse. Energy supplies could well be much worse. Supply chains are still not fully reliable. So there's major changes afoot. We don't even know what's likely in the Ukraine at the moment. I would argue that brings automatic adjustments of seeking stability, which generally speaking means bringing things back under domestic control. And we're seeing an awful lot of that. We're seeing adaptation, as I said, on all scales. Think of the whole COVID crisis. Those adaptations may be good, or they may be amateurish, or they may not work at all. But certainly that's what you get. This is a good stage for me to comment that answer the question, is it an illusion that we can control something under fundamental uncertainty? So these economies are moving to some degree into fundamental uncertainty, where they were not before. Does this mean chaos? I would say absolutely not. Does it mean wonderful control? Absolutely not. It's somewhere in the middle. Automatic adjustments happen, adaptations happen. Again, think COVID. And we sort of manage very often to bring that disruption into some outcome with reasonable boundaries. We're not totally thrown out of kilter. We're not totally in control. But with fundamental uncertainty, where you don't know what's going to happen next, there isn't an illusion that we can control. We can control to quite some degree, would be my answer. I would also say that from an emphasis on, again, 10 years ago, even 30 years ago, an emphasis on efficiency, this would have been the doctrine under highly stable conditions. We want to emphasize efficiency, economic growth, free markets, free trade, and we want to optimize all these systems. That's no longer looking that wonderful, because if anything, that makes systems less reliable. So we're shifting to a new mood or a new emphasis on self-sufficiency, systems that are resilient or can respond well, stability, responsibility, saying, okay, well, we have this thing hitting us, we take responsibility for what we can do about it. And miraculously, jobs are important because they're the fundamental stability in an economy. If people have access to the economy by having paying jobs, then that's fundamental stability. I don't want to say, and this is my last comment, that I don't want to say that all of this is just simply, I don't want to exaggerate. It's not that we're moving into a world where there's seismic events every other week, but we're definitely moving into a world where stability is sought and where consistency is sought, and definitely where we're looking, if we don't see what's coming next, and literally we don't see it, we can respond pretty well. And so this isn't an illusion of control, it's some degree of control. And I believe that that's what's facing us in the next few years. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. This is Martin Wilhelm. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you, yeah.
When we talk about fundamental uncertainty in this world we live in, would you agree that one also very fundamental thing we need to grapple with is figuring out which part of what we perceive as fundamental uncertainty is caused by, is actually real, ontological, if you will,
yep.
and which part is not truly real, but caused by misperception, by our own ways of thinking that may not be well adjusted to the reality we live in, but that, at least in principle, we could change by changing the way we perceive things. And it's probably hard to tell how much of the fundamental uncertainty we think we see is one and how much is the other. And what is your thought on that?
Well, I would certainly agree with you. I think it's a really good point that there are certain things that you can rely on. Again, take COVID, as it's very fresh in our memories here, if not in Europe, I don't know, but it's very much alive here as an experimental case to think about. What you do know, at least at a policy level, is that there are clinics and labs and pharmaceutical companies working on vaccines. What you don't know, and what we didn't know at the onset, was just how transmissible the Delta variant would turn out to be. It was not that transmissible, but it was really severe. So you don't know. And then I would add to that, in a rational world, you might be able to change attitudes. So I'm thinking here, Scandinavia, Sweden, Germany, UK, much less so here in the United States, because sadly, attitudes became politicized. And if you wore a mask, you were held to be a Democrat and therefore a sissy. And if you didn't wear a mask, you were a honcho and whatever. Some of us were mildly, this is a bit of Schadenfreude. It turned out that a lot of people who got infected were ones who didn't believe in wearing masks, or, so attitudes, I think, are extraordinarily important. Beliefs are extraordinarily important. problem is they can be manipulated in rather vicious directions, not just rational ones.
I would like to come back to what you said at the very end when you spoke about we are not out of control, but we are certainly not in control. Don't you think we also have to change what we understand by control, or to change the means of control or who controls? In other words, we cannot just say, well, there was control or full control or no control, and now we have medium control. But I think we also need to change what we understand and what we mean by control. What's your thought about that?
I completely agree that we need to think about what control means. Here's a contrast between a certain world and an uncertain world. It's kind of personal. I have 4 children, they're grown up now. But when kids are, say, 9 years and younger, you're in a relatively certain world. You can control things. If they're 13 and upwards, say to about 18, you're in a very different world where you're trying to adjust and adapt all the time. You can't totally control things. So I would take a page out of the book of life and just simply say that there are times in life where you can control things perfectly. If you're driving down a narrow road, you need to control things perfectly. Maybe there's ice on the road, etc. So you go carefully and you're in control almost to the centimeter of where you want to be. And that's the way things need to be in traffic. In other parts of life, and I'm talking about life very loosely, living life, the best thing you can do is not so much to muddle through, I don't like that, but I'd say that to accept some degree of what I would call messy vitality, not look for a pure system and a steering wheel, but rather look for a system where you're in a reasonable place. I don't want to lengthen my answer to this, but I'm reminded that years ago, if you can imagine, I used to do a lot of surfing in Hawaii, and I had a board there, a surfboard. And what I learned in surfing was that you can't control or you can't predict exactly where the wave will take you. You're on a wave, you're in green water. But that where that wave goes depends upon previous waves washing out from the beach. So it's unpredictable. What you're doing is you're trying to stay upright, you're trying to control the board, you're looking a little bit ahead, and you're trying to position yourself somewhere where you know that you will not be in white water if the wave's breaking. So you're looking all the time for openings to be in a place you would like to be, put it that way. So I completely and utterly agree. Under conditions of fundamental uncertainty, I would say you're lucky. Control is sadly loose, but that's really what gets us through life. Personally, I speak for myself. I don't know what's going to happen next, but you're trying to position yourself in a place where you will be able to react, not just reacting, but you're looking ahead to make sure you're doing the correct positioning so that you won't get into a bad spot. Jan?
Nick. Hi, Brian. It's Nick Obolensky. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Brian, you were saying that in times of, quote, fundamental uncertainty from an economic point of view, there's a natural progression to seek stability, which includes, for example, pulling back into the domestic control, quote unquote.
Yeah.
2 questions. The first question I have is, to what extent do you think that, given the fact that there is so much interconnectedness still existing that such a natural desire will actually bring that stability that is wanted. For example, in the electric car market, you know, everything is so interconnected globally that it's impossible to bring back to the domestic market. And the second question is, even if that, let's say in China you have dual circulation, so everybody's looking at that, trying to raise the domestic market more. But what do you think the unintended consequences might be in trying to solve one problem? Do you feel that we could actually be creating more problems?
Yeah. Will that create more problems? I think so. I think that, let me just say this. I think it's the case that what I'm seeing, and again, let me speak from a US base, because that's the economy I see talked about every day on CNN, places like that. What I'm seeing is a new consciousness, arising. 5 years ago, we might have said, oh, we need batteries need lithium or whatever they need. China can supply that. China knows how to do that sort of thing. Where's the lithium? Oh, well, that's in China, or the Chinese have access to that if it's somewhere else, say in Africa. What I'm seeing is a new consciousness now saying, oh, we are in really bad trouble. Supply chains got disrupted, as you know, in China. Electronic chips then were missing from car manufacturing. You couldn't sell cars without, or make them without these chips. So the car market got in trouble. And for the sake of cheap imports in China, we were paying 40%, 50% more for a new car or a used car than we otherwise might have been, because they simply weren't available. So what I see is a lot of looking around. The US is looking around saying, where do we find lithium? If not domestically, where can we lay hands on it? It's a different atmosphere. I would not expect offshoring or globalization to stop. I don't think everything will be brought home. But I do think there's a mood to say, if some goods are somewhat crucial, they form the insides of cars, we don't want to be reliant on something that's unreliable. And so let's see in the whole supply chain how we could set that up otherwise. So I wouldn't predict that everything will come back home to Europe or to the US. What I would predict, though, is that there's going to be a lot of asking, how do we manufacture the whole chain of what's needed for these particular products in a reliable way, reliable to us as a nation. I see that happening everywhere. In Europe, you see it happening, especially with energy supply.
I've been asking a few questions about path dependency at this conference before, so you are sort of present too. So I wanted to ask about this automatic adjustments. Is there a way of evaluating their effectiveness, actually? Because if they are like part of path dependence, they actually create new upheavings, or the sort of shining effect of stability is actually increasing the problem, perhaps.
Yeah, path dependence, I would argue, brings us into the international pattern that we do have. So depending on what happened in history, we are locked in or dependent on supplies, say, from China or Russia or other places. Then instability happens and we're shaken out of this, and we have to find other arrangements. Those other arrangements would lock us in or give us a new path, so that if things became stable again, we might want to shift and do a lot more offshoring. I want to point out that the phenomenon I'm talking about, going from a stable, certain type of of economic arrangements to unstable economic arrangements. That's not just happening once, that's happened many times in the past. Argentina and Brazil had an export economy that was thriving before the First World War. In fact, Argentina was better off than many economies in Europe. And they were exporting beef or exporting oil and various other things to the European market. Then there's an outbreak of the First World War. German submarines sunk Argentinian ships, maybe by mistake, whatever, but that world collapsed. And so suddenly their exports were subject to deep upheaval, not even uncertainty. Their export markets just disappeared, and they had to redo their economies. And some people would say they never fully recovered their world prominence. Argentina after that and had to redo itself. So yes, I think these things are path dependent, and yes, there's upheaval. If you get upheaval, the adjustments will follow, but you can't, I think, hope for an upheaval to happen and magically you're in a new pattern without putting in the effort of adjusting. I think that's inevitable, and we've seen an awful lot of that. I think certainly since COVID, I would argue we've seen a lot of this since 2016, where we got a new president in the US who didn't believe in treaties and arrangements.
Hi, Brian. This is Victor Galas.
Hey, Victor.
Good to see you. Have a question, be a tricky one, but many years ago, you wrote a piece called The Second Economy in McKinsey,
yeah.
which is probably one of the most brilliant summaries of our digital economy and the implications of that. But that was many years ago. So I'm thinking about the current revolution and hype around generative AI and the way deep learning systems are being infused everywhere.
Yeah.
Since you wrote that piece. So I'm thinking, what does this mean for the digital economy? Is it just accelerating the growth of the digital economy? Is it changing the direction? Is it creating new challenges? What's your take on that?
Yeah, great to hear from you, Victor. I would say all of the above that you just mentioned. It's new challenges, new possibilities. What I'd like to point out, and maybe what I pointed out in that McKinsey article, was that the digital revolution is not a revolution, say like the railway revolution. You don't have railways. 10 years later, 20 years later, you've got a network of railroads and revolution finished. The digital revolution keeps morphing, it keeps changing. It's almost like it's in a dream. So you have the availability of crunching numbers or being able to calculate, say, in the 1970s with big mainframes. You get personal computing and all that brings in offices. You get telecommunications, and that allows offshoring, and it allows a lot of international and reliable telecommunications. So it keeps morphing. What we have, and this is quite striking, something around the year 2000, so 20 years ago or so, experts would have said, and I would have agreed with them, well, human beings are very good at figuring out how, of doing associations. I see a face and I say, that's my grandmother. I see an animal, I say, that's a German Shepherd dog. So we do all this sort of association. We were shocked and surprised in 2012 when suddenly computers could do similar association. A computer on a driverless car could look down the street and say, there's a little boy running out on the road, let's slow down. Or it might say that's a poster of a child running in the road, and that's different. So we were shocked. Similarly, just to update things to only a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago, everywhere here was a buzz with talking about generative AI or large language models, whatever you want to call them, GPT-3. And suddenly you could ask GPT-3 its opinion on something. You could ask it to write legislation. In fact, in preparing this talk, I asked it about messenger RNA and to give me a quick summary of the timing on those vaccines. So suddenly we're in a world that has again surprised us. Everybody was shocked, at least here in Silicon Valley. We were all shocked, not so much that computers could do this, that was a hell of a shocker, but even more thinking, if it's true that now AI can make judgments, it can issue reports, it can intervene in maybe writing legislation. It can maybe keep a log as a captain on a ship. What white-collar jobs will remain? And along the lines of the McKinsey articles I wrote, there was another one in 2017, and I've just done an interview for McKinsey. So I keep trying to update my ideas on the digital revolution and AI. I think that AI has made a giant leap forward, and I would summarize a lot of thought here by saying we don't know what that's going to bring. We don't know what the applications are going to be. In December, we got journalists asking, isn't this going to disrupt marking of essays in schools? I thought, sure, but why don't they see what else it can do? So there's enormous possibilities and there's enormous uncertainty. And when I was putting together my list of uncertain things or upheavals, I threw that in, but I thought, oh, am I going to talk about it? Well, only if there's time. It's huge, and it's in this category where we don't fully know. We can make guesses, we could map out possibilities, we'd think of scenarios, but this may well change white-collar jobs as we know them. And so there's always two facets. Isn't it wonderful what these technologies are going to do? That'll free us up. But I'm wondering just how fast we'll be freed up so that all there is to do is not even write music or write poetry, because these machines might be able to do that easily. But I wonder what the distributive aspects of that will be, the job aspects. My guess is that we'll have shorter working weeks, much higher productivity, and this is going to work its way into the economy in the next 15 to 20 years and keep going from there, because this type of technology will improve an awful lot. So I wish I could answer your question, Victor. Maybe you're further along than I am in this, because I know you've got a strong interest in AI. But best I can do is to say, looks amazing, and I worry about the human side of this, the human aspects. But we simply don't know yet what the full extent of the implications will be.
Sean.
Thanks, John. I'm Brian Sean Clearing.
Hi, Sean.
Good to see you. Two things, and forgive me, I'm going to go wide in the context of what you said, and I'm going to draw on something that Sander used in order to set this whole conference in motion. And I'd be very interested in your reaction to it. The problem about uncertainty in an environment where citizens, for want of a better phrase, expect their government, expect other institutions in society to be able to understand things, and to a certain degree at least to be able to cause outcomes to occur. We can think of that as control or direction or whatever phrase we want to use for it. The problem in those circumstances is that when that ceases to be true, then you get large degrees of social instability, large degrees of unhappiness, a sharp decline in trust, and usually a certain degree of political disruption. The US is a perfect example of that. One doesn't need to extrapolate on that too much at present. But the point that Sander summarized very well in his introductory remarks yesterday was that part of our problem in dealing with this particular challenge is that we use essentially intellectual paradigms, constructs that we've developed to make sense of complexity. And we use those successfully as long as they work, as long as the paradigm is broadly efficient in respect of interpreting and understanding the complex circumstances that we're grappling with. Einstein famously, in a letter to Heisenberg at the time that they were having rows about all sorts of things, made this sort of curious observation that it's the theory that determines what we can observe. So our construct determines what we see and what we don't see, and Sander elaborated on that rather successfully, I think, yesterday morning. So the challenge of the present moment is the paradigm that we have used for 25, 30 years to in fact look at the sort of challenges that you were describing in respect of economic activity and social intercourse is no longer working. We don't know the answers, we can't interpret, we can't predict, we can't plan effectively, and thus, to use the general phrase, we can't control in the sense that a military man would use it in the context of command and control. How do we deal with that? How does not only the theorist, when he is reflecting on the question of how we make sense of the new patterns of interaction and activity that we can observe, but how does the policymaker respond to this level of uncertainty while regaining some measure of trust in respect of the citizens who elected him or her to office, who expect him or her to be able to do intelligent things and behave in a reasonable manner? How do we grapple with that?
All I can say is that what I'm trying to point out in this talk is that when something arrives and we don't know how it's going to affect us, COVID is one good example. Generative AI, the new sort of AI is another example. We don't know, almost by definition, if we're under fundamental uncertainty. There's some things that do arrive and we know pretty well how those are going to work out. There's a political dimension to all of this that I didn't mention very much, and possibly I should have. I didn't want to make things look too chaotic or unstable. But a lot of the problem I think we've got ourselves into is that in the previous paradigm of rather certain arrangements, then we targeted the economy towards efficiency. We outsourced a lot of things. That had a very negative effect, both in Europe and in the US, of throwing people in the middle of the country in the US out of work. They're the people who were suffering unemployment, high suicide rates, opioid addiction, and they're the people, most of them, who got angry at policymakers and pointy-headed economists and people like Hillary Clinton, and instead they elected Donald Trump. So there is a political dimension to all of this. I don't quite know what the politics will be next. Your question is, what should policymakers make of all of this? I think policymakers, the best thing you can do in a case like this, I believe, is to observe and think hard and consult the best way you can. Think of it as you're sailing into the night without very good lights. The year maybe is 1912. You're on the bridge of a ship called Titanic, which in those days was called Titanic, but we can't use that easily anymore. And you don't know how things are going to work out. You just know that there's icebergs. You slow down, you take precautions, you try to figure out what's coming next, and you stay on the bridge until you're out of danger. I don't know if I could say much more, and certainly a political analysis of uncertain times would give you a dimension where you see people left out, angry people, and therefore an opening for populism, which we're seeing all over the place, Hungary and Turkey, and not just in the US. Wish I could give better answers, but again, I think this whole world of not knowing is rather an unresearched one. And again, I would there's more than a hint in your remarks that that just thinking about things theoretically was not enough. I totally agree. I think early on with COVID, and I'm talking about March 2020, we weren't thinking that theoretically. I was in drugstores trying to purchase face masks. You couldn't get them anywhere. You couldn't get gloves anywhere, etc. We didn't know what to do. So there's lots of action. And again, I think it's like the early days of a war, maybe the early days of the Second World War, before Germany went into France. It was called the pseudo war or the silent war or something, early 1940, but you didn't know what was coming. And theoretical reasoning is valid, but it's nowhere near enough. I would give a lot of emphasis to observation and trying to make sense. But there's no way, almost by definition, if things are new and unseen and not well understood, that you can make sense.
I have another question
Yeah.
from there.
Brian, this is Pratik Patil from the YASA. I want to build up on the previous Q&A, but first I want to thank you for your book, The Nature of Technology, which I think is one of the best books I've ever read.
Thank you.
It's one of the amazing books on the evolution of technology. So thanks for that. And I'm left wondering if now our job as researchers or our responsibility is maybe to partly undo the damage that we have been, in a sense, complicit in doing with respect to especially economics. And maybe that's the way forward, with respect to how we are recommending the policymakers to move from this paradigm of efficiency towards resilience. And I'm left wondering what is, and I remember from your book, you write, we trust in nature, but in technology we put our hope. So I don't know if I don't have a clear question, maybe, but yeah. So maybe this is another one huge task that we need to do is to elaborate on the nature of technosphere that is emerging, right, and how important it is to be aware of the values that we are building into it.
Well, thanks for the question and the comments. Let me hark back to that book that I wrote, The Nature of Technology. I think I remarked in the first page or two that we put our hopes in technology, think about living longer or living better or being able to do our jobs more easily. So we put our hopes in technology, but we put our trust, our deepest trust, not in technology, but in nature. And so we feel as long as we have fresh water, as we feel at home. And when there is a new technology, think of GPT-3, generative AI, we don't know what to make of it. And I think subconsciously we're worrying all the time. How does that fit into nature? How would that fit into our human nature? If it fits well, we settle down and we don't worry. If it doesn't fit well, it's like a burr under the saddle. You will certainly need to adjust and adjust and adjust, possibly our social arrangements. One thing that, going back to Sean's comments earlier, you can't quite rely on theoretical reasoning, and I would certainly agree with that. I would look and maybe understand much better and put more emphasis on history, because we've been there before. The economy becomes quite uncertain for a while, massive upheavals, then it settles again, then it becomes more uncertain. It's not a regular cycle. We've had a long period since the Second World War where we've been in Bretton Woods arrangements. We've been able to have international trade that's reliable. But in other times, during wars or maybe famines, things are unreliable. So I think we would do well to go back and study what it's been like in other periods where there have been major upheavals and major adjustments. The politics gets disturbed, the economics gets disturbed, and things don't settle down that easily. One of my articles, I pointed out that in 1850 in the UK and Britain, there was massive technological progress. There were textile mills, there were mines that mined coal, there was iron ore, everything was happening. And yet for the workers, the conditions were miserable. There was lack of safety, there was child labor, there were women put down mines, hauling, these trucks on rails within mines. It was pretty ghastly, and it took a few decades to work its way out of that. I think that academia could do well not to think so much in short term. How are we going to balance the economy? Those sorts of things are under reasonable control. What isn't under reasonable control is thinking more in the long term. Where are we heading? Where have we been? How did we cope with that in the past? There were times in the past we didn't know what was happening or what should happen. How did we get through that? And I think so that's not just a shift in what is worth studying, it's a shift in mindset. It's kind of like, I think if you've done any survival training and been outdoors for lengthy times, maybe on your own, maybe you're interested in survival and you're thinking and studying, what have I done in the past? What do I know from what my friends have done? I'm familiar with this in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in Colorado, and there's bears. And so you're getting along, but you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know when you might run out of water or your food would get stolen by a bear, etc. So you adopt a different mindset. I wish I could say more, but this is a world of uncertainty where you don't know, and there's limits, I think, to what you can control. What I'm trying to emphasize is that we do pretty well in the past, at least of COVID. It's far from perfect, but we do and can cope.
I think I'll give the last question to Sander van der Leeuw.
The man himself.
Many things, but in this particular case, I'm referring to both you and Sean. I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is that we are maybe at best trying to find a solution B or a plan B. I would argue that what is happening both in the US and in Europe, with the increased emphasis on the diversity between the different states and the different countries, is actually, if you take it as a large-scale vision, a very interesting way to develop at the same time a number of different plans, B, C, D, and whatever. And so for me, and it's partly an answer to Sean, I think the interesting idea would be to do what, for example, the Chinese do. They have a particular solution that gets intellectually created in their DRC, and then they create a region in which it can be applied. And they look at the results, and if they work out, they will actually enlarge that to a larger sphere. So my sense of it is that one of our handicaps is the sort of universalist thinking, the thinking in a limited set of solutions.
I would completely and utterly agree. In economic development, it's becoming possible, say in India, to try out different policies in different states in India or in different small regions. So yes, I do think that we should not limit our thinking just to say, here's one policy, we all wear face masks or something. I think we can set up what I would call evolutionary experiments, because evolution, if we see what is effective, then that can be very quickly adopted in a sort of evolutionary way into the mainstream. So I completely agree with you. I think that's imaginative, and I think it's certainly part of getting through uncertain times. If I have one thing I want to emphasize in this talk, which is a sort of a rather peculiar subject matter, it's that I don't think people have thought that much about an economy operating in conditions where you simply don't know what's going to happen next. And yet, to some degree, that's what we're in. So I would welcome any new thinking along these lines. And that's a great idea, Sandra.
Okay. I think.
Thank you for this and for a lot of other things.
Great to hear you, Sandra.
I think the next best thing to you being here in Stockholm, Brian, is to see you on a tremendous screen. Well, thank you very much. We had a great conference so far, and this is a wonderful talk at the end of the second day for us, the beginning of the first of the day for you. We'll continue tomorrow, and I will let you know how it goes.
Thanks indeed, Jan. And I would just like to say on behalf of Paralimes, I don't know any organization that has a history of putting together conferences with wonderful ideas and wonderful people that can beat Paralimes. And that all goes back to one person who's standing in front of you on the right, that's Jan. So well done, and I'm honored to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question, actually. Several people alluded to it during the discussions over the coffees, and in a way, Brian mentioned something too. We do something in this conference that is quite extraordinary in the sense that ideas come up and thoughts are being expressed, but somehow it's very difficult to reach a large audience with this. And we need to reach that large audience in order to find the funds to to continue this. So I wonder whether, I don't want to start a discussion now, but I wonder whether you'd be willing to think about this a little bit. And that tomorrow in the coffee breaks, we can talk, some of the people we can talk with if they have good ideas on this. But we can do that already over the wine that is now being served. So I propose that we go to the lobby, or what do you call it, lobby, the place where the wine is. I mean, that's all right. Thank you very much.